Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Imagine working your entire life, saving every penny, making sacrifices, and doing everything in your power to give your family a better life, only to be tossed aside like you never even mattered. That is exactly what happened to me when I spent my entire life savings helping my parents buy their dream home, only to watch in horror as they handed the deed over to my stepbrother at the housewarming party, smiling as they told me, "He deserves it more." At that moment, something inside me snapped. I had spent years being the responsible one, the one who always helped, the one who never asked for anything in return, and now I had nothing. But if my parents thought they could betray me like this and walk away without consequences, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Growing up, I always believed that family meant loyalty, that no matter what happened, we would always look out for each other, that when things got tough, we would stick together. Maybe that belief came from childhood innocence, or maybe I just wanted to believe it because the alternative was too painful to accept. But whatever the reason, I spent most of my life putting my family first, working harder than I needed to, saving more than I spent, and making sure that whenever my parents needed help, I was the first one to step up. I was never the selfish one, never the child who asked for too much, never the one who made demands. My parents had always told me they were proud of that I was the responsible one, the one they could count on, the one who would never abandon them. And I believed them, believed that my sacrifices mattered, that the long nights, the missed vacations, the careful budgeting, all of it meant something. I had spent my 20s working hard, keeping my expenses low, resisting the temptation to splurge on things I wanted because I had my eyes set on something bigger. A home of my own, a future I could build on, something that I had earned through years of discipline. But then my parents came to me with a problem, one that, at the time, I didn't even hesitate to solve. They told me they wanted to buy a house, but property prices had risen beyond what they could afford. They had found a beautiful home in a nice neighborhood, a place they had always dreamed of, but they were short on funds. I remember my mother's voice shaking just slightly as she told me how much this house meant to them, how it was perfect, how it would be a fresh start for our family. And, of course, I never once questioned their intentions. Without thinking twice, without hesitating for even a second, I told them I would help. I had been saving for years, planning for my own future, but in my mind, helping my parents was the right thing to do. They raised me, supported me when I was younger, and gave me everything they could. Wasn't it my turn to give something back? What kind of person wouldn't help their own parents when they needed it most? So I drained my entire savings account, every last dollar, and handed it over to them without conditions, without contracts, without worrying about protecting myself. In my heart, I believed this was a family investment, a shared opportunity that we would all benefit from in the long run. My parents reassured me that this house was for all of us, that this would be the place we would celebrate holidays together, where we would create memories, where I would always have a home no matter what. For weeks, I watched as my parents excitedly toured homes, picking out furniture, planning renovations, talking about how they wanted to decorate every room. They talked about gardening, about Christmas dinners in the dining room, about how much happier they would be once they had finally moved in. And every time they smiled, every time they thanked me, every time they said how grateful they were, I felt like I had done something good, something worthwhile. I told myself that this was what family was supposed to be, that this was how things should be, that I was doing the right thing. But looking back now, I realize how blind I was, how foolishly trusting I had been, because the moment they got what they wanted, they made it clear that I was never part of their plans. The first sign came in subtle ways, little moments that didn't seem like much at first but now feel so obvious in hindsight. Conversations that once included we and us slowly shifted to them and Daniel, my stepbrother. "I think Daniel will love this backyard," my mom said one afternoon as she scrolled through photos of the house. "I was thinking about turning one of the rooms into an office for Daniel," my father mused. It was strange, hearing my stepbrother's name so often, especially since he had never been involved in the process. Never once contributed a dime toward making this house a reality. But I ignored it, brushing it off as my parents just being excited, just wanted to make sure everyone was comfortable. Then, as the closing process neared, the way they spoke about the house changed even more. My parents stopped saying things like, "This will be our family home," and instead started referring to it as the great opportunity for Daniel. A place where Daniel can finally settle down. A house that will give Daniel a better future. Each time, I felt a tiny pang in my chest, a quiet warning that something wasn't right. But I buried it, refusing to believe that my parents would ever do something to betray me, refusing to let doubt creep into my mind. It wasn't until the housewarming party that the truth came out, that I finally saw my parents for who they really were. It wasn't until they stood in front of our family and friends and handed my stepbrother the deed, smiling, beaming with pride as they told him, "This is yours now, Daniel. You deserve it more than anyone." And in that moment, standing there as my entire world shattered around me, I realized the truth. I had spent my entire life investing in a family that never once invested in me. The housewarming party was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of joy, a time to gather with family and friends and bask in the accomplishment of securing a beautiful home that would belong to all of us. I walked through the front door feeling proud, eager to see the house finally filled with laughter and warmth, believing, foolishly, that this was the beginning of something wonderful, that this was proof of what we could accomplish when we supported one another. I had imagined my parents introducing me to guests, telling them about how I had helped make this happen, about how we had worked together to build a future, about how this house would be a place for all of us to grow and thrive. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it, an unease so heavy it settled in my chest like a stone. The first thing I noticed was the way people looked at me, their smiles tight and uncomfortable, their eyes darting away just a second too quickly, as if they knew something I didn't, as if they were waiting for me to figure it out. A few of my aunts and uncles gave me quick, pitying glances, as if they wanted to say something but didn't dare. My stepbrother, Daniel, stood at the center of the living room, his posture relaxed, his grin wide and confident, exuding an air of satisfaction that I couldn't quite place. My parents were beside him, standing close, their expressions beaming with a pride so deep it made my stomach turn. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overthinking, that I was being irrational, that my mind was playing tricks on me. This was supposed to be a happy occasion, a new beginning, and I didn't want to ruin it by letting paranoia creep in. So I forced a smile, ignored the sinking feeling gnawing at my gut, and stepped deeper into the house, trying to convince myself that nothing was wrong. But then my mother called for everyone's attention, her voice warm and full of excitement. And in that instant, I knew that something was very, very wrong. "We wanted to do something special today," my mother announced, her voice filled with a tenderness that made my skin crawl, her gaze barely flickering in my direction before turning back to Daniel. "This house is more than just a home. It's a fresh start, a new beginning, and we couldn't think of anyone who deserves it more than our wonderful son, Daniel." The words didn't register at first, didn't sink in, didn't compute. I stood there, frozen, waiting for the part where she would mention me, where she would acknowledge my role in all of this, where she would say something, anything that made sense. But instead, she turned to Daniel, smiling so brightly it nearly blinded me, and with a grand gesture, she handed him a thick envelope. I watched, numb and disoriented, as my stepbrother took it, his fingers trembling slightly, his eyes shining with something close to disbelief. He opened the envelope slowly, carefully, pulling out a stack of official-looking papers, and the moment I saw the words printed at the top, the air was ripped from my lungs. The deed. The house deed. My parents had just given him the house. The house I had paid for. The house that was supposed to be ours. The house that was meant to be a family home. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't do anything except stand there and watch as my stepbrother clutched the deed to the home that had been stolen from me, his lips parting in shock, his entire body stiff with barely contained excitement. And then, as if to drive the knife even deeper, my father turned to me, his voice light, almost dismissive, as he said the words that would change everything. "You already have a good job, a stable life. Daniel needs this more than you do." The world around me blurred. I heard the words, processed them, understood them, but somehow they still didn't make sense. I had worked my entire life, sacrificed everything to build something for all of us, given them everything I had, and now I was being told that none of it mattered. That because I had been responsible, because I had built a life for myself without needing constant handouts, I was being cast aside like an afterthought. I opened my mouth, ready to protest, ready to demand an explanation. But before I could even speak, my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with forced sweetness, her hands reaching for mine as if to soften the blow. "Sweetheart, you have to understand," she said gently, squeezing my fingers like she thought physical affection could erase the betrayal of what she had just done. "Daniel has struggled so much, and he deserves a chance to finally have something of his own. You're doing so well for yourself. Don't you want to see him happy?" Happy. They wanted him to be happy. As if my happiness had never mattered. The betrayal hit me in waves, rolling over me with a force so strong I thought I might drown in it. I searched their faces, desperate for something that would make this make sense, but all I saw was certainty, a calm assurance that they had done the right thing, that this was fair, that I should be grateful for all the things they hadn't taken from me. I was nothing more than a resource to them, a means to an end, someone they had never seen as equal to Daniel, someone they had never truly valued beyond what I could provide. And in that moment, standing there in the home I had built for them, watching my stepbrother bask in the glow of my sacrifice, I realized something that should have been clear all along. I had never really been a part of this family. I was just the one who paid for it. The weight of my father's words settled over me like a crushing force, suffocating, unbearable, pressing down with a weight so heavy it made my fingers tremble at my sides. I stood there, frozen in place, feeling the betrayal seep into my bones, realizing, truly realizing, that I had never been more than a resource to them, a convenient solution to their problems, a walking bank account that they could drain when necessary and discard when my usefulness had expired. My mother's face was still stretched into that artificial, practiced smile, her eyes shining with false warmth, as if expecting me to accept their decision without question, as if expecting me to understand why my sacrifices had been dismissed so casually. My stepbrother, Daniel, stood with the house deed in his hands, his face plastered with an expression of disbelief so thick it was almost laughable, as if he couldn't believe how easily he had just been handed everything I had worked for. He didn't even have to ask for it. He didn't have to struggle, didn't have to make sacrifices, didn't have to drain his savings, didn't have to give up years of his life to ensure our parents had a home. I had done that. I had built this foundation, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. And now I was expected to smile and nod while they handed everything over to him without hesitation. I wanted to believe this was some cruel misunderstanding, that any second now my mother would turn to me with a sheepish laugh and say something like, "Of course, this is your home too." But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became that this wasn't a mistake, wasn't a moment of thoughtlessness, wasn't a slip of the tongue. This had been planned, orchestrated down to the smallest detail, and the only thing I had ever been to them was a means to an end. The worst part? They knew how much this would hurt me, and they simply did not care. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't the kind of rage that exploded outward, wild and uncontrollable. It wasn't the kind of fury that caused screaming or broken furniture or chaos. No, this was different. This was cold. It settled deep in my chest, a slow, creeping thing that burned with icy precision, calculating, deliberate. I took a slow breath, forced my fingers to unclench, and straightened my spine, letting the silence stretch long enough for discomfort to settle in the air. If my parents expected me to cry, to beg, to cause a scene so they could spin the story in their favor, they were about to be very disappointed. I turned to Daniel first, watching as he clutched the deed like a lifeline, his fingers curling around the edges as if afraid someone might take it away from him. His grin had faltered slightly, doubt creeping into his expression as I took a single step forward, tilting my head slightly. "Have you checked what's in that envelope?" I asked, my voice deceptively calm. His smile flickered, confusion knitting his brow. "What?" I gestured toward the documents in his hands, watching him swallow hard before flipping open the envelope, his fingers fumbling slightly as he pulled out the paperwork. My parents were still smiling, though my mother's expression had tightened ever so slightly, her eyes darting toward me as if finally sensing that something was wrong. Daniel scanned the papers quickly, flipping through them, his shoulders stiffening with each passing second. And then I saw it, the exact moment the reality of the situation hit him. The blood drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly, lips parting as if to protest, but no sound came out. His hands trembled, gripping the paper so tightly his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting between me and our parents in growing panic. My father frowned, stepping closer, his voice suddenly sharp. "What's wrong?" I exhaled slowly, savoring the moment before delivering the final blow. "Oh, you didn't think I would just hand over my money without securing my interests, did you?" I asked, my voice light, almost amused. I turned to my mother then, watching as her face twisted in unease, her fingers curling together like she was trying to physically hold herself together. "You didn't actually think I was stupid enough to give away my entire savings without making sure I had some protection, did you?" My stepbrother let out a sharp breath, shaking his head slightly, his entire body rigid with disbelief as he flipped through the papers again, as if hoping he had misread something. I watched as he reached the final page, the one that spelled out in very clear terms exactly what I had done. He looked up at my parents, his voice shaky as he spoke. "The mortgage," he rasped, barely able to get the words out. My name isn't on the mortgage. The tension in the room sharpened. My father's expression darkened. My mother sucked in a sharp breath, her mouth parting slightly like she was about to argue, but I cut her off before she could even begin. "That's right," I said, taking a slow step forward, my voice filled with something cold and final. "I co-signed the mortgage, which means my name is still legally tied to this house. Which also means that if my name is taken off the deed, the bank calls the entire loan immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically see the wheels turning in my father's head, the calculations happening behind his eyes as he processed what that meant. It didn't matter that the house was in Daniel's name now. Without me, without my financial backing, without my steady income supporting the loan, the bank would demand the full amount be paid immediately. And if they couldn't pay, the house would go into foreclosure. Daniel's hands were shaking now, his eyes darting frantically between the papers, desperate for a loophole, desperate for a way out of this mess he had so happily walked into. "You can't do this," he muttered, his voice laced with panic. I shrugged, letting the corner of my mouth tilt into the faintest smirk. "I already did." My father's jaw clenched. My mother's lips trembled. Daniel looked like he was going to be sick. And me? For the first time in years, I finally felt like I was the one in control. The weight of my words settled over the room like an unbearable fog, thick and suffocating, pressing against every single person who had stood there moments ago, celebrating what they thought was a victory. My stepbrother, who had been glowing with smug satisfaction just minutes before, now looked as if the ground beneath him had cracked wide open, as if he was teetering on the edge of a precipice, one wrong step away from losing everything. His fingers gripped the paperwork so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting desperately across the words, searching for some kind of escape, some loophole, some way out. My parents, who had stood beside him with pride in their eyes, had now gone completely still, their expressions frozen in something close to panic. My mother's smile had disappeared entirely, her lips pressing together so tightly that they had turned a pale shade of white, her hands trembling ever so slightly at her sides. My father, whose voice had been so firm, so confident when he told me I didn't need this house, now looked suddenly uncertain, his brows furrowed as he processed what was happening, as if he couldn't comprehend how their perfect little plan had fallen apart so quickly. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each second stretching out painfully, filling the silence with an unbearable weight. The guests, who had been whispering excitedly before, now stood in uncomfortable stillness, exchanging glances that ranged from curiosity to outright discomfort, some shifting uneasily as they watched the disaster unfold in front of them. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to be the one to break the unbearable silence. No one wanted to acknowledge the fact that my parents had just destroyed themselves in front of everyone. It was my father who finally spoke first, clearing his throat in an attempt to steady himself, though I could hear the faintest tremor in his voice. "What do you mean, the bank will call the loan?" he asked, his words forced into something almost resembling a laugh, as if he needed to believe this was just some misunderstanding, as if he thought that if he acted like this wasn't a big deal, it would somehow become less real. I turned to him, keeping my expression completely neutral, refusing to let them see the storm that was raging inside me, refusing to let them see just how much I wanted to let my anger take over. My voice, when I finally spoke, was calm, unwavering, and filled with a level of certainty that left no room for misinterpretation. "It's simple," I said, shrugging slightly, my tone carrying an air of almost casual indifference, like I was explaining something that should have been painfully obvious. "When I agreed to help you buy this house, I didn't just hand over cash. I co-signed the mortgage. The bank approved the loan based on my financial record, my credit score, my ability to make payments. Without my name attached, the bank won't trust the loan anymore. So if you take me off the deed, the entire balance becomes due immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as the realization slammed into them like a tidal wave, saw the slow spread of horror creep across their faces as the reality of their betrayal finally caught up with them. My mother's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out, her hands curling in a fist at her sides, her shoulders stiffening as she turned toward my stepbrother, as if expecting him to have an answer. But he didn't. There was no answer, no solution, no escape from the disaster they had walked willingly into. My stepbrother let out a sharp breath, shaking his head slightly, his fingers trembling as he clutched the paperwork in his hands. He flipped through the pages again, scanning them, rereading every word, desperate to find something, anything, that would make this not real, as if he thought that if he looked long enough, the truth would somehow change. That can't be right, he muttered under his breath, his voice barely more than a whisper, his face losing even more color as he reached the final page, the one that left no doubt about where things stood. You wouldn't do that. The words were so pathetic, so small, so filled with the kind of desperation that only comes from someone who has never had to fight for anything in his life. He looked up at me then, his eyes wide with something that almost resembled fear, his breathing uneven as he searched my face for some sign that I was bluffing. Right? I tilted my head slightly, letting the silence stretch, watching him squirm, watching the weight of his own entitlement crush him from the inside out. And then I responded, my voice steady, cool, unshaken. You tell me, I said, my words slow, deliberate, leaving no room for doubt. Would you have done this to me? He didn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. We both knew that if the roles had been reversed, if I had been the one handed a house I didn't deserve, if he had been the one left standing there empty-handed, he wouldn't have cared. He wouldn't have hesitated to walk away with everything, wouldn't have lost sleep overtaking what wasn't his, wouldn't have even thought about what it cost me. And now, for the first time in his life, he was being forced to face the reality of what it meant to have something taken from him, to have something he thought was a slip through his fingers before he could fully grasp it. I could see the panic setting in now, see the rapid rise and fall of his chest as the realization settled in his bones, as the weight of what was happening fully registered. My mother let out a shaky breath beside him, reaching for his arm, as if somehow that could stabilize him, as if somehow her touch could make this less real. My father had gone completely still, his jaw tight, his eyes dark and unreadable, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides like he wanted to fix this, but knew deep down that there was no fixing what had just happened. Because this wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about a house. This was about consequences. And for the first time, they were finally the ones who had to face them. The air in the room had shifted completely. The once lively atmosphere now replaced with an uncomfortable, suffocating tension that settled over everyone like a thick, heavy fog. The guests, who had arrived expecting a joyous housewarming celebration, now stood frozen in place, their whispered conversations filling the silence, their eyes darting between me, my parents, and my stepbrother, as if they were witnessing something far more interesting than any speech or toast they had expected to hear tonight. Some of them looked uneasy, their hands clasped tightly in front of them, their expressions a mix of sympathy and secondhand embarrassment, while others seemed downright amused, as if they were watching a live drama unfold right in front of them, unable to look away from the slow-motion disaster unraveling before their eyes. My stepbrother still had the house deed in his trembling hands, his face contorted in something between disbelief and desperation, his eyes frantically scanning the papers as if somehow, some way, the words would suddenly change, offering him an escape from the harsh reality pressing down on him. My parents stood beside him, no longer glowing with pride, no longer filled with self-satisfaction, no longer reveling in the moment where they had thought they were rewarding their more deserving child. My father let out a sharp breath, dragging a hand down his face, his posture stiff, his entire body radiating the kind of tension that came from realizing too late that he had miscalculated, that he had made a grave mistake that couldn't simply be undone with a few words and forced apologies. We'll figure this out, he muttered under his breath, his voice low, quiet, almost as if he didn't want the guests to hear, as if he still held out some small, fragile hope that this could be fixed before it completely destroyed the image they had spent years maintaining. But there was no confidence in his voice, no certainty in his posture, no plan forming behind his eyes. Only fear, only panic, only the dawning realization that the control he had always believed he had over this family had slipped right through his fingers. My mother, who had spent the entire party beaming with pride, soaking in the compliments, basking in the admiration of her guests, now looked small, her entire body curled in on itself, her hands twisting together as if wringing them hard enough would somehow make this moment disappear. Her lips parted slightly, the forced smile still lingering, though it was no longer one of pride, no longer the smug expression of someone who thought she had won. It was the shaky, wavering smile of someone who knew they were losing everything. "Sweetheart, we can fix this," she said, her voice strained, cracking slightly at the edges, as if she truly believed she could just talk her way out of this like she always had before, as if her words alone could erase the betrayal, erase the manipulation, erase the fact that she had chosen my stepbrother over me in the most blatant, humiliating way possible. This was just a misunderstanding, a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, letting out a hollow laugh. The bitterness in my tone, so sharp it cut through the room like a blade, slicing right through whatever excuses she had been about to give me. I took a step forward, my gaze locking onto hers, watching as she flinched slightly, as if she could feel the weight of her own guilt pressing down on her, as if she finally understood, truly understood, that she had miscalculated, that I wasn't just going to walk away like she had expected me to. No, Mom. A mistake is forgetting to send a text. A mistake is losing your car keys. A mistake is burning dinner or missing an appointment. What you did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, a deliberate one. The silence that followed was so thick, so absolute, that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, could hear the shallow, unsteady breathing of my stepbrother as he clutched the papers in his hands, could hear the hushed, frantic whispers of guests who were pretending not to watch but couldn't help themselves. My mother's lips quivered, her hands clenching together so tightly I could see her knuckles turning white. But she didn't say a word, didn't try to argue, didn't try to defend herself, because she couldn't. She knew I was right, and I wasn't done yet. I took another slow step forward, feeling the weight of every single year I had spent trying to earn their love, every single moment I had sacrificed, every single time I had put them first, only to be discarded the second they got what they wanted. I could feel all of it burning inside me now, rising to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be spoken aloud, demanding to finally be seen. And now, you're going to live with the consequences. My words hung in the air, final, unshakable, undeniable. My father's hands curled into fists at his sides, his jaw clenching as if he was physically restraining himself from lashing out, his eyes darkening with something I couldn't quite place. Was it anger? Was it regret? Was it fear? I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care. My stepbrother's breath was coming in short, rapid bursts now, his face pale, his fingers still gripping the deed, as if refusing to let go would somehow make all of this disappear. And my mother? She finally dropped the act. The forced smile vanished completely, her face falling into something empty, something broken, something gutted. Her shoulders slumped slightly, her hands slowly lowering to her sides, as if the weight of what she had done had finally crushed her. For the first time, I saw it, the truth, the moment she finally understood that she had lost me. And for the first time, I didn't care. Because this was the moment they had chosen. And now, they were going to live with it. The weight of the moment hung between us, thick and suffocating, pressing down like an unbearable force, filling the air with something so heavy it made it hard to breathe. My mother stood frozen in place, her hands trembling, her eyes wide and filled with something desperate, something that almost resembled fear, something that told me, finally told me, that she understood just how badly she had miscalculated. She had always believed she had control, had always believed that no matter what she did, no matter how much she took, no matter how much she betrayed me, I would always come back, always forgive, always be the one who swallowed my pride and moved on for the sake of keeping the family together. But this time was different. This time, she could see it, could feel it, could hear it in the cold finality of my voice, could see it in the way I stood firm, unshaken, unmoved, unwilling to be manipulated ever again. Her breath hitched, her fingers twitching slightly, as if she wanted to reach for me, as if touching me would somehow bring back the person I used to be, the person who would have never stood up for myself, the person who would have never dared to walk away. But that person was gone, had been stripped away the moment she decided I was nothing more than a convenient piggy bank, a disposable option, an afterthought in her carefully constructed world where Daniel always came first. "Please, honey, don't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling, cracking under the weight of what was slipping through her fingers, the first real hint of panic beginning to seep into her expression. "We're family." The words hit me like a slap, not because they meant anything, not because they carried any weight, but because they were so hollow, so meaningless, so infuriatingly predictable. We're family. That was the excuse, the justification, the weapon she had always used to bend me into submission, to guilt me into forgiving, to manipulate me into giving more even when I had nothing left. She had spent years using those words as a shield, wielding them like a sword whenever it was convenient for her, expecting me to fall in line, expecting me to accept whatever she did, expecting me to always be the one who gave in. But I wasn't that person anymore. I stared at her, the woman who had raised me, the woman I had spent my entire life trying to please, the woman I had sacrificed everything for, only to be tossed aside when it suited her, only to be told that I didn't matter the second I was no longer useful. And yet, even now, even in the face of everything, she still thought she could manipulate me, still thought that the word family would be enough to erase the betrayal, still thought that pleading with me would somehow undo all the pain she had caused. I let the silence stretch between us. Let her feel the weight of my refusal. Let her see the resolve in my eyes. Let her understand that there was no undoing what had already been done. And then, with a voice steady and firm, I finally spoke the words I had been holding inside for far too long. "No," I said, my tone unwavering, my expression unyielding. "We stopped being family the moment you decided I didn't matter." The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's face crumpled, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes filling with real tears this time. Not the forced, performative ones she had used so many times before, not the ones designed to make me feel guilty, but the kind that came from realization, from consequences, from losing something she never thought she could lose. My father had gone eerily quiet, his jaw locked tight, his hands clenched in a fist at his sides, his entire body rigid with tension, as if he wanted to argue, wanted to fight back, wanted to force me to take back what I had just said. But he didn't, because even he could see it now. There was no coming back from this. My stepbrother, Daniel, stood off to the side, still clutching the deed, as if it would somehow protect him, his face contorted with something that almost looked like shock, as if he truly hadn't expected things to go this way, as if he had genuinely believed that my role in this family had been to give and give and give without ever expecting anything in return. He had spent his entire life benefiting from my sacrifices, from my parents' favoritism, from the expectation that I would always be the responsible one. And now, for the first time, he was watching that expectation crumble right in front of him. I turned to him next, my voice cold, measured, carrying the weight of every single moment I had spent being second to him. "I hope it was worth it," I said, my tone sharp enough to cut through whatever delusions he still had. "I hope you enjoy the house while you still have it. Because without me, you're not keeping it for long." His mouth opened slightly, his lips parting as if he wanted to argue, as if he wanted to deny what we all knew was true. But nothing came out, because he knew. He knew the moment the bank called the loan, the moment the reality of foreclosure set in, the moment he realized that his new home was about to be ripped right out from under him, he would have no way to stop it. And that was his problem. I turned back to my parents one last time, watching as my mother wiped at her face, watching as my father avoided my gaze, watching as the weight of their own choices came crashing down around them. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice quiet but firm, filled with something that sounded almost like grief, but not quite. "I spent my whole life trying to be enough for you. But the truth is, I was never enough. No matter what I did, no matter how much I gave, no matter how much I sacrificed, I was never Daniel. And that meant I never mattered." My mother let out a choked sob, shaking her head, her lips moving as if she wanted to deny it. But I didn't let her speak. "But that's over now," I continued, my tone final, resolute, unshakable. "You made your choice. Now you get to live with it." I turned without another word, walking toward the door, feeling the weight on my chest finally begin to lift as I left them standing there, left them to deal with what they had done, left them to face the reality of what they had lost. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being left behind. This time, I was the one walking away. The days that followed were nothing short of a disaster for them. A slow unraveling of everything they had so confidently believed was theirs, a brutal wake-up call that they had never expected to face. My stepbrother, who had once stood at the center of the housewarming party with a smug grin on his face, who had once clutched the deed in his hands like he had earned it, who had once looked at me as if I were nothing more than a footnote in his good fortune, now found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The reality of the situation hit him hard, the weight of what had happened crashing down on him with an unforgiving force, suffocating, inescapable, utterly merciless. The bank, the very institution that had once so eagerly approved the loan when my name was attached to it, wasted no time in making their position perfectly clear. They didn't care about my stepbrother's entitlement, didn't care about my parents' excuses, didn't care that they had assumed they could make decisions without considering the actual consequences. Banks didn't operate on blind favoritism, didn't work on empty justifications, didn't bend for people who thought they deserved special treatment. The second my name was removed from the financial equation, the moment the bank saw that Daniel alone was responsible for the mortgage, they did what they were always going to do. They called the loan immediately. And suddenly, the house, the one my parents had so proudly handed over to him, the one they had convinced themselves was his rightful home, the one they had stolen from me without a second thought, was no longer something they had the power to keep. At first, they tried to fight it, tried to push back, tried to negotiate with the bank as if their pleading would somehow change the reality of the numbers staring them in the face. My father made call after call, his voice strained, his frustration growing with every passing hour, but it didn't matter how angry he was or how much he tried to argue. He had nothing to offer, nothing to bargain with, nothing that would convince the bank to magically ignore the fact that they had no way to pay off the mortgage. My mother, who had once stood beside Daniel with her hands clasped in joy, who had once looked at me with barely concealed indifference when they stripped me of everything I had worked for, now looked shaken, now looked small, now looked like she was genuinely beginning to realize the depth of what she had done. Daniel, however, was worse. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. He didn't fight. He panicked. He had spent his entire life being coddled, being given things, being handed opportunities that he never had to earn. And now, for the first time, he was being forced to deal with the consequences of something being taken away from him. He didn't know how to fix things, didn't know how to carry responsibility, didn't know how to function without someone else cleaning up his messes. He had never been the one expected to stand on his own 2 feet, and now, when it mattered most, he had no foundation to stand on at all. And so, as expected, the inevitable happened. The foreclosure notice arrived. The house, the one I had paid for, the one they had stolen from me, the one they had so proudly given to Daniel as if it were a gift he was entitled to, was now being ripped right out from under them. I wish I could say I felt something when I heard the news, that I felt some deep sense of vindication, that I felt some overwhelming surge of satisfaction watching everything they had taken from me slip through their fingers. But the truth was, I didn't feel anything for them. Not anger, not bitterness, not joy, not even pity. I had spent too many years carrying the weight of their expectations, had spent too much time sacrificing everything for them, had spent too long being manipulated into believing that their happiness was my responsibility. And now, finally, I was free of it. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel trapped. I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next betrayal, the next moment where I would be expected to give while they only took, the next time my parents would look at me with disappointment simply because I wasn't Daniel. I was done. I was free. The moment I walked away from that house, from that family, from the people who had spent their entire lives taking from me without a second thought, I felt something shift inside me, something I had never truly felt before, peace. There was no hesitation in my steps, no lingering doubt, no last-minute urge to turn around and give them another chance, because I finally understood the truth that had been staring me in the face my entire life. I had never truly belonged to them, not in the way a child should belong to their parents, not in the way a sibling should be valued, not in the way family should love unconditionally. To them, I had always been the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who could be used when it was convenient and discarded when it wasn't. I didn't waste time wondering what would happen next. Didn't sit around waiting for the inevitable call where they would try to manipulate me back into their lives. Didn't let myself be consumed by thoughts of whether they regretted their decisions or if they had finally realized what they had lost. It didn't matter anymore. I was done living my life through the lens of their approval, done waiting for them to see me as someone worthy, done allowing myself to be weighed down by the false hope that maybe, just maybe, one day they would wake up and finally love me the way I had spent my entire life loving them. Because now, for the first time, I was choosing myself. My parents, once so confident in their decision, once so certain that I would always be there to support them, once so sure that their golden child could take my place without consequences, were now left with nothing. The home they had fought so hard to steal from me was no longer theirs. The financial security they had expected me to provide was gone, and the son they had bet everything on had proven himself to be exactly what he had always been: incapable, irresponsible, entitled, and utterly useless when it mattered most. My father, a man who had always spoken with such authority, who had always controlled the narrative of our family, who had looked me in the eye and told me that I would be fine without the house I had paid for, now had to face the cold, hard truth that he had gambled everything on the wrong child. My mother, a woman who had once smiled as she handed my sacrifices to someone else, who had believed that I would always forgive her, who had spent years twisting the definition of family to suit her own needs, was now forced to reckon with the reality that family wasn't just a word she could wield like a weapon when it was convenient. And my stepbrother? He lost everything. The house that had been handed to him on a silver platter was no longer his. The security he had taken for granted had vanished overnight, and for the first time in his life, he was forced to stand on his own 2 feet without anyone there to carry him. He had spent his entire life believing he was special, believing that no matter what happened, things would always work out in his favor. believing that he deserved the best without ever having to work for it. But now, there was no one left to shield him, no one left to make excuses for him, no one left to clean up his messes. And I felt nothing for them. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even pity, because for the first time in my life, they were no longer my problem. I built something new, something separate, something strong, something that was mine alone. I didn't waste time mourning the family I had lost, because in truth, I had never really had them to begin with. Instead, I poured my energy into rebuilding my life, into creating something that belonged only to me, into surrounding myself with people who actually valued me instead of using me until there was nothing left to give. I found a home that was mine, not one built on broken promises, not one tied to people who saw me as nothing more than a source of money, not one that could be stolen the moment they decided I didn't deserve it. It was small, not as grand as the one I had helped buy for my parents, not something that would impress a crowd or leave people in awe, but it was mine. Every dollar spent on it came from my own hard work. Every piece of furniture carefully chosen because I liked it, every inch of it built on my terms, with no one else's approval needed. And as I stood in the doorway of my new place, staring out at the future that was finally mine, I let out a slow breath and smiled. Because sometimes, walking away isn't just a choice. It's the only way to win.